On the morning of August 13th, 2026, while standing before reporters in Panama City, thousands of miles from the Persian Gulf, United States Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth delivered a message that landed like a hammer blow across Tehran's corridors of power. 3 words captured it: indefinitely, rotate, continue. Indefinitely, the United States Navy can maintain a blockade like that, Hegseth told the press corps, because we'll rotate ships in and out, as we have, and we'll continue to. That statement, reported by Reuters correspondents Phil Stewart and Idris Ali, who traveled with the Secretary to Panama, was not a passing remark tossed out at the end of a press conference. It was a deliberate, calculated signal aimed at allies, at markets, at the American public, and above all, at Tehran. The era of timed deadlines, temporary pauses, and rotating ceasefires appears to be over. Washington has drawn a line in the water, and according to the man who commands the world's most powerful military, that line is now permanent. To understand why those words carry the weight they do, why they reverberated through oil markets, diplomatic channels, and naval war rooms within hours, you have to go back to the very beginning of this conflict. A conflict that, by August 2026, has already redrawn the energy map of the planet, consumed hundreds of thousands of lives and livelihoods, and pushed global oil markets to the edge of a cliff the world has not stood on since 1973. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated surprise airstrikes against Iran. The targets included military installations, government buildings, and senior leadership. According to the documented record of the 2026 Iran war, Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was among the leadership killed in the opening hours of those strikes. Iran's command structure was severely disrupted, but Iran did not collapse. Instead, within days, Tehran ordered what would become the most consequential act of economic warfare since the Arab oil embargo: the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow 21-mile-wide choke point between Iran and Oman, through which roughly 20 million barrels of oil had flowed every single day before the war, representing approximately 20% of the world's seaborne oil trade, and 20% of global liquefied natural gas shipments, was shut down. The Congressional Research Service, in its analysis published by Congress, Gov, confirmed these baseline figures for the Strait's pre-war significance. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz was not simply a military counterstrike. It was an economic weapon aimed at the arteries of the global economy. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, issued warnings forbidding any vessel passage through the waterway, boarded and attacked merchant ships attempting to transit, and laid sea mines in the Strait's narrow shipping lanes. Shipping firms, facing the immediate risk of losing vessels worth hundreds of millions of dollars and crews of dozens of sailors, suspended operations with remarkable speed. What had been one of the planet's busiest maritime highways, handling 130 to 140 ships per day, became, in a matter of weeks, a near-silent ghost lane punctuated only by the distant sound of military aircraft and the occasional detonation of naval ordnance. Before continuing, it is worth pausing to fully appreciate the weight of what Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz meant, not just strategically, but in terms of the global energy architecture that billions of people depend on every day. The Congressional Research Service report published by Congress. Gov laid out the economic geography with clinical precision. The Strait's 2 unidirectional shipping lanes facilitate the transit of crude oil primarily from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iraq, and Qatar, the heartland of global oil production. Before the war, Qatar's liquefied natural gas, some of the most critical heating and electricity generation fuel for Europe and East Asia, moved almost entirely through the Strait of Hormuz. The disruption of that flow was not an abstraction. Within weeks of the Strait's closure, European gas storage facilities were drawing down at accelerated rates. Asian LNG spot prices spiked to their highest levels since the 2022 energy crisis, and governments from Tokyo to Berlin were reassessing their emergency energy contingency plans. The International Energy Agency, recognizing the scale of the threat, coordinated a release of 400 million barrels of crude oil and refined products from 32 member countries' emergency reserves, as documented by the Congressional Research Service. The United States alone announced it would contribute 172 million barrels of crude from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve over a 120-day period. By the beginning of July, IEA member countries had released 276 million barrels in total, a historically extraordinary intervention that underscores just how severe the supply disruption had become. The United States was not going to accept that. On March 19, 2026, the U.S. military launched an aerial campaign against Iranian naval targets positioned along the Strait of Hormuz, attempting to reopen the waterway by force. The campaign, conducted jointly with the Israeli Air Force, targeted IRGC vessels, drone launch platforms, shore-based anti-ship missile batteries, and coastal military infrastructure. It was a formidable application of air power, but even months of sustained U.S. and Israeli airstrikes could not fully break Iran's operational grip on the strait. The IRGC adapted its tactics, dispersed its assets, and continued identifying and striking commercial vessels that attempted to pass through without Iran's explicit permission. The U.S. had firepower. Iran had geography, patience, and a willingness to absorb punishment that proved far greater than Washington's initial assessments had expected. Under pressure from Pakistan and China, two major regional powers with deep economic stakes in the energy supply chain, the United States and Iran agreed to a 2-week ceasefire on April 8, 2026. Pakistan served as the mediator, and the ceasefire halted the highest tempo bombing operations in exchange for the prospect of peace negotiations. The Islamabad talks were convened to transform that fragile pause into a permanent agreement. They failed. Iran's counterdemands were far beyond what Washington could accept. According to reporting from Press TV and the documented record of the ceasefire negotiations, Iran demanded an immediate end to all U.S. and Israeli attacks on Iran and allied forces in Lebanon and Iraq, concrete security guarantees against future military aggression, war reparations, and, most provocatively of all, international recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz itself. The United States rejected those conditions. The talks collapsed. And 5 days after the ceasefire began, something significant happened. On April 13, 2026, the United States imposed a formal naval blockade on Iran. Every vessel entering or leaving an Iranian port, whether located inside the Strait of Hormuz or anywhere along Iran's broader coastline, was now subject to interception by U.S. Navy forces. The blockade was commanded under the direct authority of President Donald Trump, with operational execution falling to CENTCOM commanders Brad Cooper and Samuel Paparo. According to CENTCOM figures documented in multiple sources, 85 vessels had been intercepted under the blockade's enforcement. 3 ships were seized outright. Lloyd's List, the maritime intelligence and shipping industry publication, separately reported that 26 vessels had managed to bypass the blockade through alternative routes or timing, a figure the U.S. government disputed. The blockade was real, the enforcement was kinetic, and the economic consequences began accumulating immediately. President Trump himself claimed on April 22, 2026, that the naval blockade was costing Iran the staggering sum of $500 million every single day. The U.S. Department of Defense, in its own institutional assessment, estimated that by the 1st of May, Iran had already lost $4. $8 billion in oil revenue as a direct consequence of the blockade. These are extraordinary figures. They reflect just how comprehensively Iran's economic life depends on oil exports, and how completely those exports depend on access to its ports in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's government had built its budget, its social spending, its military programs, and its foreign policy influence on the foundation of petroleum revenue. The blockade was not simply a military instrument, it was a blade aimed directly at the Iranian state's financial heart. There was a brief, fragile window of hope in June of 2026. On June 17th, President Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed a memorandum of understanding. The document described in detail by the Congressional Research Service in its Strait of Hormuz analysis. Under the terms of the MOU, Washington agreed to lift the naval blockade, and Tehran agreed to allow safe passage of commercial vessels through the strait without charge for a period of 60 days. The deal was meant to provide breathing room for substantive, longer-term negotiations. It did not deliver that outcome. The agreement fell apart. The underlying conditions that had made the conflict intractable remained in place. The blockade was reimposed. And as of August 13, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz is experiencing traffic volumes that would have been almost incomprehensible to anyone observing the waterway before the war. Reuters, reporting cited across multiple major outlets, including the Spokesman Review and Arab News, confirmed that shipping through the strait fell to just 8 vessels on a recent Tuesday, compared to a 10-day average of roughly 12 and the pre-war daily average of 130 to 140 ships. News Nation's reporting placed the collapse in even starker terms. Strait of Hormuz traffic is now approximately 90% lower than its daily pre-war average. What that means in practice is that one of the most critical energy arteries in human history is operating at 1/10 of its normal capacity. And into this landscape of economic devastation and military standoff, on the morning of August 13th, walked Pete Hegseth, in Panama City, Panama, thousands of miles from the Persian Gulf, attending Panamax 2026. The context of that location is not trivial. Panamax is an annual multinational military exercise specifically focused on improving joint operational capabilities, enhancing regional security, and ensuring the protection and free flow of commerce through the Panama Canal, another of the world's critical maritime chokepoints. The choice to make this blockade declaration from a gathering focused on protecting a separate critical waterway was, whether deliberate or not, symbolically loaded. Washington was essentially telling the world, we understand the importance of open maritime lanes of commerce, and we are the power that guarantees them, everywhere but Iran. The Panama Canal context also serves as a reminder that the United States has a long history of asserting control over strategic waterways when it believes its national security or economic interests demand it. Hegseth had spoken to the crew of the USS Gridley, a guided missile destroyer that had previously completed a Middle East deployment in support of blockade operations. Then he turned to the reporters traveling with him. And he said it clearly, without hedging, without qualification. The United States Navy can maintain this blockade indefinitely. Ships will rotate, operations will continue. There is no end date Washington is willing to specify, because there is no end date Washington intends to honor. This was not a statement of capability made in passing. It was a considered strategic declaration delivered in front of the international press at a moment when ceasefire talks have gone nowhere, when Iran's conditions for peace remain unacceptable to Washington, when the global economy is visibly suffering the consequences, and when domestic political pressure on the Trump administration is building from multiple directions. Hegseth was, by making this statement, signaling to Tehran and to the world that the United States has made a strategic commitment from which it does not intend to retreat. But the Defense Secretary was not the only member of the Trump administration delivering a thunderclap message that day. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent appeared on Newsmax's Rob Schmitt Tonight program and issued what can only be described as an economic ultimatum without historical precedent. Watch this space for more announcements coming next week, Bessent said, as reported by Reuters and confirmed by CNN's live coverage, because we are going to apply measures like have never been seen in the history of economic isolation on a country. He went further, spelling out the combined approach Washington intends to deploy. It will be a combination of economic isolation like the world has never seen before, and the continued blockade in the Strait of Hormuz that will keep anything from going in or out of the Iranian ports. No further details were offered. No specific measures were named, but the trajectory is unmistakable. The United States is preparing to compress Iran's economy in ways that go beyond anything attempted against any nation, including Russia following 2022, including North Korea over decades, including Cuba over more than half a century of sanctions. This dual declaration from Hegseth and Bessent came in the immediate aftermath of a remarkable 24-hour period of escalating rhetoric. The day before, on August 12th, President Trump had posted on his Truth social media platform in terms that left no ambiguity about his intentions. The USA has total control over the Strait of Hormuz, Trump wrote, as confirmed by Euronews, CBS News, and Fox News Digital. Now, I think we will keep it. Our naval blockade is being called by everyone a wall of steel, and there's nothing Iran can do about it. They have no navy, they have no air force. Their remaining soldiers are unpaid, the IRGC is decimated and fleeing, and their leadership is uncertain at best. They have no money, their country is shot. Trump had made similar assertions before, repeatedly claiming that the U.S. had total control of the strait. Iran has, with consistent firmness, rejected those claims every single time. Tehran wasted no time responding on August 13th. Iranian officials pushed back directly, telling the press that the Strait of Hormuz is under Iran's control and management, a flat contradiction of Trump's claim, in a statement that reflects the genuine complexity of who actually dominates this waterway. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, son of the late Ali Khamenei, who was killed in the opening airstrikes of the war, has been making significant appointments in reshaping the country's military and national security leadership since assuming power. CBS News confirmed this week that Mojtaba Khamenei has been actively restructuring Iran's command, signaling that Iran's new leadership corps is consolidating rather than buckling. The idea that a leadership transition would weaken Iran's resolve appears, based on the available evidence, to have been a significant miscalculation in Washington's initial strategic assumptions. Far from collapsing under the dual pressure of a leadership decapitation and a naval blockade, Iran's new political establishment appears to have hardened its position, and Tehran's posture has calcified into something cold and calculated. According to reporting by NewsNation, Iranian officials are now signaling that the country will not seek to end the conflict while Donald Trump remains in office, that Iran intends to simply wait him out. It is a remarkable and sobering position, suggesting a government that has concluded the cost of endurance is lower than the cost of negotiating under pressure with an administration it does not trust. That calculation, painful as it is for millions of ordinary Iranians bearing the economic weight of the blockade, contains its own strategic logic. The ceasefire of April collapsed within days. The June MOU fell apart before its 60-day window could produce meaningful progress. A senior Iranian source told Reuters in the days before August 13th that from Tehran's perspective, the ceasefire had no formal start date, and therefore nothing needed to be extended, a legalistic position that reflects a government that has stopped treating American proposed frameworks as serious foundations for peace. The question of whether Tehran's strategy of endurance can outlast Washington's political will is not merely an abstract geopolitical puzzle. It has direct material consequences for the American domestic political environment. The war that began in February 2026 is not popular at home. High fuel prices, caused directly by the collapse of Strait of Hormuz shipping, have dragged President Trump's approval ratings downward in a way that is beginning to threaten his party's control of Congress in the November midterm elections. Reuters noted explicitly in its August 13th, reporting that Trump is under pressure at home to end a war that is deeply unpopular. Throughout this conflict, Trump has oscillated between the language of imminent escalation and the language of imminent peace, at various points threatening to hit Iran hard, suggesting the U.S. might seize strategic islands in the Gulf, or floating the possibility of bombing desalination plants. He has, according to Reuters, so far resisted deploying ground troops or following through on those most extreme threats. Earlier this week, Trump appeared to pivot toward emphasizing economic rather than military means. Whether that pivot holds, given his history of abrupt directional changes, remains to be seen. Now consider the USS Abraham Lincoln, because that aircraft carrier's story is, in many ways, the story of this entire conflict told from the inside out. The Lincoln, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, departed Naval Base San Diego on November 21st, 2025. It was conducting exercises in the South China Sea. In January 2026, the Trump administration ordered the carrier and its full strike group to divert immediately to the Middle East. The Lincoln has been at sea ever since. By August 13, 2026, as confirmed by Fox News Digital and EA Worldview, the carrier had been deployed for more than 250 consecutive days, and had not come ashore for over 200 of those days, setting what is described as a record for consecutive days at sea for a U.S. aircraft carrier in the modern era. The conditions aboard the Lincoln have become a crisis that is now drawing Senate attention. Stars and Stripes and Navy Times reported this week that there had been multiple incidents of crew members attempting to go overboard, a devastating indicator of the psychological toll being extracted from the approximately 5,000 sailors and Marines packed onto the ship. Family members have raised urgent concerns with Navy leadership about supply shortages, contaminated drinking water, broken plumbing systems, deteriorating mental health, deck safety hazards, and disruptions to mail delivery. A sailor did go overboard from the Lincoln earlier this month. The U.S. Navy confirmed the incident in a statement, noting the sailor was quickly recovered and transferred off the ship for further care. Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut sent a formal letter on August 12th to both Hegseth and Acting Navy Secretary Hung Chau, demanding transparency and accountability. The Trump administration must explain what they are doing to support sailors on the USS Abraham Lincoln, who have been continuously at sea for nearly 7 months, Blumenthal wrote, as reported by EA Worldview. Widespread reports of supply shortages, plumbing issues, deteriorating mental health, and more demand immediate attention. Media reports cited by CNBC indicate that the USS George Washington is now being prepared to relieve the Abraham Lincoln in the Middle East theater, which is, as Hegseth said, exactly what rotation looks like in practice. It is standard naval doctrine. The U.S. Navy does have the theoretical capacity to sustain this operation through rotations over an extended period. But the human cost aboard the Lincoln, and the questions being raised publicly by senators about transparency over those conditions, is a variable that critics say deserves far more official attention than it has received. On the very same day Hegseth was delivering his indefinite blockade declaration from Panama City, Iran provided a blunt reminder that this conflict has not paused for anyone's press conferences. 2 vessels belonging to the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, the state-owned energy giant known as ADNOC, were attacked while transiting the Strait of Hormuz on Thursday evening. UAE state news agency WAM carried the initial reports, confirmed by the UAE's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The ministry condemned the strikes as Iranian attacks and described them as flagrant maritime violations. According to Fox News Digital's live coverage, the UAE ministry cited United Nations Security Council Resolution 2817, adopted in March of this year, which explicitly demanded that Iran halt strikes against Arab Gulf states and shipping lanes. The ministry characterized the attacks as acts of piracy carried out by the IRGC. No injuries were reported, but the strategic message was unmistakable. On the day Washington declared the blockade would never end, Tehran struck ADNOC ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is where the entire contest is being decided, and Iran wanted to remind everyone on that specific day that it still has weapons, and it is still willing to use them. Earlier in the same week, the United States had provided its own kinetic demonstration of blockade enforcement. A U.S. Navy MH-60 Seahawk helicopter fired two AGM-114 Hellfire missiles directly into the engine room of a Panama-flagged cargo ship after the vessel repeatedly ignored warnings from U.S. forces. The ship had been sailing toward Iran in violation of the Naval Blockade. According to CENTCOM's statement, as reported by News Nation and others, the vessel was struck off the coast of Pakistan as it sailed into the Gulf of Oman. The ship is no longer transiting to Iran in violation of the U.S. blockade, which remains in full effect, CENTCOM stated. The use of anti-tank Hellfire missiles against the engine room of a civilian-flagged cargo vessel, however clear the blockade violation, is a measure of how far this conflict has escalated from conventional naval deterrence. This is not a symbolic blockade. It is enforced with precision munitions. Beyond the Strait of Hormuz itself, the regional picture continues to darken. Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi movement, which has been a persistent destabilizing actor in Red Sea and Gulf of Aden shipping since 2023, and has re-escalated significantly since the Iran war began in February, reportedly targeted a Saudi Aramco refinery facility with drones this week, according to Reuters. Reporting cited in multiple outlets, including the Spokesman Review. The market reaction was immediate. Oil prices, which had settled more than 2% lower on Thursday on weak global demand signals and rising U.S. crude inventories, were unsettled by the Saudi Aramco targeting reports, renewing trader and analyst concerns about the possibility of a widening regional war that draws Saudi Arabia's energy infrastructure into active threat range. Saudi Arabia is the world's largest oil exporter. Any sustained disruption of its refining or export capacity would add a new and potentially catastrophic dimension to a global supply picture that is already at its most stressed in decades. That picture, as assessed by the International Energy Agency in its August 12th forecast, is deeply concerning. The IEA now projects that global oil supply will fall by 3 million barrels per day this year, representing roughly 4% of total global supply. Critically, the IEA had forecast just 1 month ago a drop of 7 million barrels per day. The revision upward by 600,000 barrels per day reflects the failure of peace negotiations, the reimposition of the U.S. blockade, and the continued suppression of Strait of Hormuz shipping traffic. Global economists have grown increasingly vocal in recent weeks about the trajectory of world economic growth. Multiple institutions have forecast a sharp deterioration in global GDP as a direct result of this war, with some warning that select regions may already be sliding toward recession if the conflict is not resolved within the coming months. The longer the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed or severely restricted, the more those warnings migrate from forecasts into financial headlines. Which brings us back to the central question that Hegseth's declaration from Panama City and Trump's Truth Social posts calling the blockade a wall of steel have forced into sharp relief. Who actually controls the Strait of Hormuz? The honest answer, and the one that CNN's detailed analysis offered with appropriate care, is that neither side has unambiguous or comprehensive control. The picture is genuinely contested. The United States has clear military and economic superiority in the region. Heavy sanctions, frozen Iranian assets held overseas, and the naval blockade itself have strangled Iran's cash flow and compressed its ability to fund both its domestic government and its foreign policy activities. Months of U.S. and Israeli airstrikes have struck Iran's leadership structure and damaged significant portions of Iran's military capacity, including the naval assets the IRGC uses to threaten commercial shipping. Former U.S. Pacific Command Joint Intelligence Center Director Carl Schuster told CNN that the U.S. still has a clear military and economic advantage. But Schuster also noted, and this matters enormously, that U.S. military forces in the region are stretched pretty thin after months of sustained operations. The U.S. needs to replenish and rotate its forces to maintain operational leverage, which is exactly what the reported USS George Washington movement is designed to accomplish. Iran's leverage, meanwhile, does not come from symmetric military power. It comes from geography, from asymmetric tactics, and from the demonstrated willingness to sustain enormous costs in pursuit of strategic objectives. The IRGC does not need to defeat the U.S. Navy in open battle to maintain leverage over the strait. It needs only to ensure that shipping companies remain unwilling to risk their vessels and crews in those waters. CNN confirmed that fear is well-founded. Few merchant shipping companies and their ships are confident that the U.S. can ensure their safe transit of the strait. With Thursday's ADNOC attacks being the latest demonstration of that continuing threat, the commercial shipping calculus remains deeply risk-averse. It is important, before concluding, to be honest about what remains unverified or contested in this story. The claim that the blockade is costing Iran $500 million per day is President Trump's own public statement from April 22, 2026. It is a U.S. government figure, not an independent institutional assessment. The Pentagon's estimate of $4. $8 billion in oil revenue lost by May 1st similarly originates within the U.S. government and has not been independently confirmed by international bodies such as the IMF or World Bank. Iran has consistently disputed U.S. characterizations of the blockade's economic impact. The competing claims about who controls the Strait of Hormuz reflect genuinely contested realities on the water, not a situation where one side is straightforwardly correct. Reports about the depth of the humanitarian and operational crisis aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln come from Stars and Stripes and Navy Times, based on interviews with sailors and family members. Credible outlets, but the Pentagon has not independently confirmed the full scope of the conditions described beyond acknowledging the sailor overboard incident. The reporting that Iran is planning to wait out Trump until he leaves office is based on statements from unnamed Iranian officials cited by NewsNation. Plausible given Tehran's stated negotiating posture, but not confirmed through named official channels. The primary sources for this analysis include Reuters wire service reporting from Phil Stewart and Idris Ali in Panama City on August 13, 2026, Reuters and AP dispatches picked up by Arab News, The Spokesman Review, WSAU, and Al Monitor, CNN's live news coverage and analytical reporting on Strait of Hormuz control dynamics, Fox News Digital's live updates from August 13th, CBS News live updates, Euronews, EA Worldview, the Congressional Research Service's published analysis available through Congress, Gov, CNBC's economic reporting, and the documented records of the 2026 United States naval blockade of Iran, the 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis, and the 2026 Iran war ceasefire. So where does this leave us, and where does it leave the world? The Strait of Hormuz, that irreplaceable 21-mile-wide artery through which a fifth of the planet's energy once flowed freely every single day, is now the arena of one of the most consequential naval standoffs of the 21st century. The United States has told Iran, through its Defense Secretary, its Treasury Secretary, and its President, in language that admits no ambiguity, that the naval blockade will not end. There is no clock running down in Washington. There is no exit ramp being extended. The U.S. Navy will rotate ships. Economic sanctions will be tightened further, to unprecedented levels if Scott Bessent's words are taken seriously. The Strait of Hormuz will remain the front line of this contest, and Iran is striking ad-no-see vessels, is signaling it will absorb the economic pain, is telling the world the waterway remains under its management, and is, if the reports are accurate, calculating that it simply needs to outlast one American presidential term. The war that began 6 months ago, on February 28, 2026, is not approaching a resolution. It has not reached a decisive turning point. It has settled into something harder and colder and more open-ended. A war of attrition and economic exhaustion, fought through naval blockades, Hellfire missiles fired into engine rooms, drone strikes on Gulf refineries, and the quiet, grinding suffering of 5,000 sailors aboard an aircraft carrier that has been at sea for 250 days with nowhere to come home to. The fundamental question that every analyst, diplomat, and government watching this conflict from a distance is now grappling with is one that Washington and Tehran each claims to have answered, but have not. If the blockade has no end date, and if Iran is genuinely willing to withstand its consequences indefinitely in exchange for the strategic principle of sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, then what precisely is the path to resolution? Can economic and naval pressure alone force Tehran to change course and return to negotiations on terms the United States can accept? Or does Iran's demonstrated willingness to absorb the pain of this blockade, while still inflicting economic pain on the entire world, suggest that the current strategy requires a fundamentally different approach? That is the question we would like to put to you. Given everything you have heard, the indefinite blockade, the unprecedented economic measures being promised, Iran's counter-strategy of strategic patience, the human cost aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln, and the 90% collapse in Strait of Hormuz shipping, what do you think the endgame of this conflict looks like? And do you believe the United States has the right strategy to get there? Share your analysis below. This has been a documentary review of one of the defining geopolitical crises of our era. The conflict is now in its 7th month. Today's declarations from Panama City have made clear that the men directing American policy believe time and naval power are on their side. Whether history will agree with that judgment remains one of the most important open questions of the decade.